The Morgan family disappeared without any trace during the town's yearly summer gathering. 30 years later, Jake Davis, who had been their 7-year-old neighbor, returned to the police station with a shocking account no one could have imagined. The small town of Willow Creek had always boasted a close-knit community. Its single main street was lined with family-run shops, and the gentle ringing of the church bell marked the hours. The town thrived on a simple, trusting rhythm. Everyone knew everyone, or so it seemed. The Morgans had blended into this scene perfectly. Alex and Linda Morgan were friendly, yet kept to themselves. They were more likely to lend a hand at local events than join in idle chatter. Their son, Ryan, was a quiet, inquisitive 10-year-old who often played alongside Jake Davis, the 7-year-old from next door. Together they roamed the nearby woods, built forts, and shared secrets that no one else knew. Although the Morgans weren't the most high-profile family in town, they were a familiar presence, until one summer evening they just vanished. Their home was discovered strangely empty, with lights left on, a partly eaten meal abandoned on the table, and the door left ajar, with no sign of a struggle. Detective Carter, who was just beginning his career at the time, led the first investigation. He recalled the odd details: the open front door, the car still parked in the driveway, and absolutely no signs of forced entry. It was as if the Morgans had simply disappeared into thin air. By morning, search teams had combed through every corner of the town, yet the Morgan family was nowhere to be found, leaving only unanswered questions behind. They left no note, made no calls, and left no clues to follow. Rumors started flying around. Some wondered if they had run away, while others suspected something much darker had happened at home. Every lead eventually hit a dead end, and the mystery of the Morgans became one that lingered for years. Numerous detectives reopened the case, but time, despite passing 3 decades, hadn't eased the sting of never knowing what really happened. Jake Davis was only a child when his best friend disappeared, and he grew up with that mystery hanging over him. He avoided talking about that night and claimed he remembered nothing odd, but people still whispered that maybe he or someone in his family knew more than they admitted. Just as the town had nearly given up on solving the mystery of the Morgan family, Jake's quiet and uneasy return to the police station stirred up old memories. After 30 long years, the mysterious case started to reopen. Sitting in a stark interrogation room, Jake fidgeted with his hands as if he were trying to squeeze out a hidden truth he wasn't ready to reveal. Now 37, he had long shed the carefree spirit of childhood for a cautious, tired air. Detective Carter observed him closely. This was the same boy who once ran freely with Ryan Morgan, now carrying a burden that had taken decades to show. "Let's start at the beginning," he said. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Jake might fall back on the rehearsed responses he'd used for years. But then, as if the words had been stuck inside him for too long, he blurted out, "I remembered something I didn't understand back then." He explained to the detective that he had seen his own parents arguing with the Morgans the night before they disappeared. "It was intense. My dad was yelling," Jake recalled. "I was playing in the living room when I saw them on the Morgans' porch. My mom looked scared, like she really wanted to get involved but couldn't. Linda Morgan had held her ground, though she seemed upset too." Jake said he couldn't make out what they were arguing about. All he remembered was his mom pulling his dad away. Detective Carter leaned back in his chair. In all his years working the case, no one had ever mentioned any argument between the Davis family and the Morgans. This new detail was something he wasn't going to let slide. The next day, Detective Carter and Officer Collins stood on the Davis family's porch when Mrs. Davis opened the door. Her face quickly shifted from surprise to guarded discomfort. "It's been a long time," she said softly but with caution. Carter nodded, his tone steady and firm. "Yes, ma'am. We'd like to ask you and your husband a few questions about the Morgan family." Mrs. Davis hesitated, her hand gripping the doorframe, and then slowly let them in. As they stepped inside, Mr. Davis emerged from the kitchen, visibly tense. "What's this about?" he demanded. Carter replied, "We've received some new information. Jake mentioned he saw you outside the Morgan house the night before they vanished." The reaction was immediate. Mr. Davis's jaw tightened while Mrs. Davis fumbled with a coffee pot. That was over 30 years ago, Mr. Davis said. I don't see how what we say now can help. He insisted that the argument Jake described had been nothing serious, just a misunderstanding, something they barely recalled, and their nervous reactions only made Carter more suspicious as he pressed for further details. Mrs. Davis's eyes kept drifting to a cabinet in the corner of the living room. At first it seemed unimportant, but the more she avoided it, the more it caught Officer Collins's attention. When he asked if he could take a look inside, she said it was private and refused. Carter exchanged a look with Collins. "If you're hiding something, now's the time to tell us," he said, but the Devises remained silent, and their reluctance spoke volumes. Back at the station, Carter and Collins prepared the papers for a warrant. They believed that cabinet held a key clue, though they weren't sure how. Hours later, with the warrant in hand, the officers returned. Mrs. Davis opened the door again, her eyes downcast as she stepped inside. Carter signaled to the cabinet. "We're opening it now." With a quick twist of the lock, the cabinet door creaked open, revealing a jumble of old letters, photographs, and a worn leather-bound diary. Collins picked it up and flipped through its pages. It belonged to Mrs. Morgan. Carter carefully read each entry. Every page revealed something more surprising than the last. Mrs. Morgan had written about increasing tensions with the Devises, hinting at arguments and subtle threats. "Listen to this," Carter said as he read aloud. "They know something. We can't let them control us, but I'm really scared." Mrs. Davis sank into a chair and insisted it wasn't what it appeared to be. Carter closed the diary and stated, "It looks like the Morgans were really scared of you, and we're going to find out why." A short while later, Detective Carter and Officer Collins found themselves in the Davis backyard, staring up an old treehouse. The wooden boards were worn, and a rickety ladder swayed in the breeze. Jake used to stand aside and say, "Ryan and I left little messages up there," he recalled quietly. "If someone wanted to hide something, that's where they would." The officers climbed into the treehouse cautiously. It was like a time capsule from their childhood, with scribbles etched into the walls and a faded comic book in the corner. Collins's flashlight eventually fell on a small, dusty wooden box wedged in a corner. When he pried it open, he discovered a stack of folded notes that turned out to be Ryan's. The first few pages were innocent, full of tales of adventures and secrets that only kids would share, but as Carter read on, the tone grew darker. Ryan's notes revealed that he was scared, claiming, "They're hiding something from me," and one note said, "Mom and Dad keep whispering about the Devises. I think they're in trouble." One note, written in shaky handwriting, mentioned a spot in the woods. "If things get worse, we'll head to the cabin." Carter's mind raced. The idea of a hidden cabin in the thick woods around Willow Creek might hold the answers they needed. 2 days later, a search party scoured the dense forest. After hours of walking through thick brush, Officer Collins called out, "Over here." The group pushed aside the undergrowth and came upon a clearing where an old, abandoned cabin stood, overtaken by wild plants. Its wooden structure sagged with age and vines clung to its sides, yet it remained intact. Inside, the air was stale and dust blanketed every surface. As their flashlight swept the room, it was clear the Morgans had been there. A child's toy lay in one corner, and a blanket was draped over a makeshift bed. Collins picked up a small shoe, while Carter's attention was caught by a worn journal hidden between the floorboards. His heart skipped a beat. "This is Mr. Morgan's journal," he murmured, kneeling to free it carefully. As he flipped through the pages, he scanned each entry, hoping to find any clue about the family's disappearance. Maybe something fell through when they left, whether it was in the cabinet or the floor. He speculated softly as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to align. "They were on the run," he whispered, reading further. The entries revealed that the Morgans felt threatened by the Devises and believed they had no choice but to leave town. Alex Morgan had written about being blackmailed by the Devises, who held something from their past over them. The journal detailed how desperate they were, including plans to leave and arrangements to meet someone who could help them vanish. The final entry sent shivers down Carter's spine. "If we don't leave now, I don't know what will happen to us." He read, "Tonight, We meet our contact. After that, we're gone. The cabin had given them some answers, but it also raised more questions. One thing was clear: the disappearance of the Morgans wasn't random. Someone had assisted them, and the key to unlocking the mystery was finding out who that was. Back at the station, Detective Carter pored over Mr. Morgan's journal. One name jumped out, a name scribbled hastily among the notes: Green. It was mentioned alongside vague references to arrangements and a plan. Carter tapped his pen and muttered, "Green." Just then, Officer Collins stepped into the room carrying a file. He had tracked down a retired private investigator named Martin Green, who had been active in the area around the time the Morgans vanished, though he had moved away years earlier. The next morning, Carter and Collins arrived at a modest house on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. The lawn was unkempt, and the house's paint was peeling, but the mailbox confirmed they were in the right place. Martin Green was a lean man in his 70s. He answered the door, his sharp eyes scanning their badges, and reluctantly let them in. When asked about the Morgans, he remarked that it was all from long ago. Carter leaned in and said, "We believe you helped them disappear. The journal mentions you." Green sighed and admitted that he had indeed helped them. They were scared and desperate, he explained. They claimed the Devises were blackmailing them, and they just wanted to disappear. So I set things up for them. He went on to say that he had helped them secure new identities and find a fresh start. Then Green fetched an old, dusty ledger from a shelf. "Everything I kept is in here," he said, "all coded back then because I didn't want anyone snooping around." Carter skimmed through the book filled with cryptic notes and symbols. "Can you help us figure this out?" he asked. Green nodded and promised to do his best. Later at the station, Green decoded the messages while Carter looked on closely. One series of entries caught Carter's eye. It pointed to a safe deposit box at First Trust Bank in Brookville. Green explained that this was where they had planned to store everything in case they needed it. The next day, Carter and Collins found themselves in the bank's vault. After the manager confirmed their warrant, they were led to a small steel box. Collins pried it open, and out spilled a trove of secrets. Neat stacks of cash, a set of forged passports, and official-looking documents with new identities for the Morgans. Carter picked up a weathered envelope marked for emergency only. Inside was a letter from Alex Morgan. "If you're reading this, it means we're gone. We only wanted to keep our family safe." With all the evidence gathered, Carter felt the puzzle pieces finally clicking into place, though one burning question remained. Where were the Morgans now? Detective Carter and Officer Collins regrouped in the Davis living room, where the tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Across from them, Mr. and Mrs. Davis sat stiffly, their faces showing a mix of fear and stubborn defiance. Carter laid the forged documents and cash on the coffee table and said, "We found these in a safe deposit box linked to the Morgans. Can you explain why they felt they had to vanish?" Mrs. Davis's face paled while Mr. Davis's jaw tightened. Carter leaned forward and continued, "We also found Mrs. Morgan's journal, and it mentions your threats, the blackmail, and how the Morgans were scared of you. It's all over now. Tell us the full story." Mrs. Davis began trembling. "Years ago, before we moved here, the Morgans got involved in some shady business. They thought they'd left that behind, but we discovered the truth." Mrs. Davis explained that it had been a business deal gone wrong. Someone got hurt, and the Devises used that information to keep the Morgans under control. Alex Morgan was a talented accountant, Mr. Davis reluctantly admitted. "We had him tamper with the books, at first just small things, but then he wanted out, and we couldn't let him go without consequences." Tears streamed down Mrs. Davis's face as she added, "The Morgans refused to keep quiet, so they threatened to expose us. They argued with us the night before they left, saying they'd go to the police if we continued our blackmail." Carter stood and declared, "Mr. and Mrs. Davis, you are under arrest for blackmail, obstruction of justice, and your part in the disappearance of the Morgan family." The next day, Carter and Collins drove along a winding country road until they reached a modest house set among a grove of trees. After 30 long years, the moment felt surreal. Carter knocked firmly on the door, and a man in his 60s opened it. His face bore the marks of time, but there was no mistaking that he was Alex Morgan. His eyes widened as he saw the officers. "I'm Detective Carter," he said softly. "From Willow Creek. We know who you are, Mr. Morgan. You don't need to run anymore. The DeVises have been arrested." Alex froze, gripping the doorframe tightly. Moments later, Linda Morgan appeared, her face filled with fear and disbelief as she asked if this was really happening. Carter nodded. "It's true. You're safe now." Then, from the back of the house, a man in his late 30s stepped forward, a grown-up version of the boy Carter remembered from old photos. Ryan's eyes flitted between the detectives and his parents. "There's no need to hide any longer," Officer Collins reassured him. "We've uncovered everything. The DeVises can't hurt you now." A month later, the courtroom was packed and the atmosphere tense as the trial of Mr. and Mrs. Davis began. Reporters scribbled notes quickly, while locals leaned forward in anticipation. Detective Carter observed from the gallery with quiet intensity. The Morgans sat at the front, ready to finally face the past that had haunted them for decades. Alex Morgan was the first to testify, his voice steady as he recounted years of blackmail and fear. "They held a secret from our past," he said, "using it to control us and threatening to ruin our lives if we didn't comply." Linda Morgan followed, adding, "We lived in constant fear. When we refused to give in to their demands, they got even more aggressive, and we had no choice but to disappear to protect our family." Ryan's emotional testimony hushed the courtroom. "I was just a kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never really understood why we had to leave. I only knew my parents were terrified." The evidence that Detective Carter and his team uncovered, the forged documents, the financial records, and the reluctant confessions, painted a damning picture. The jury deliberated only a few hours before delivering a guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced the DeVises to decades in prison for blackmail, fraud, and obstruction of justice. After the trial, the Morgans returned to Willow Creek. The town that once mourned their disappearance welcomed them back with open arms. Old friends embraced them, and tears flowed freely. Standing on the porch of their old home, Alex looked out at the town he once knew and said, "It feels so good to be home." The Morgans were finally free. Nearby, Detective Carter stood at the edge of Willow Creek's town square, watching as the community gathered to celebrate the long-awaited closure of the Morgan case. The air buzzed with laughter and chatter, yet Carter's thoughts lingered on the journey that had led to this moment. 30 years of unanswered questions, endless dead ends, and a family forced to flee in fear had finally come to light. For Carter, the case wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about restoring a piece of the town's spirit. The disappearance of the Morgans had left a deep scar, but now, seeing Alex, Linda, and Ryan among their neighbors, Carter felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This case wasn't just about justice, he confided to Officer Collins. It was about giving people hope again, a real sense of closure. Have you ever heard of a case where someone disappeared for decades before the truth came out? Let us know in the comments. For now, that's all. See you in the next story.